USDA logo, United States Department of Agriculture.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our P&P 630 Data Management and Public Access Requirements for ARS overview prepared for the Office of National Programs. My name is Paul Wester. I'm the Director of the National Agricultural Library here in Beltsville, Maryland. And we're very excited that you're able to join us today for this overview of P&P 630. The first item on our agenda is for me to introduce Dr. Marlon Eve, who is the Deputy Administrator for Natural Resources and Sustainable Agricultural Systems, who's going to offer some remarks about the context of this new policy and its importance for us. So I turn the program over to Dr. Eve.
Thank you, Paul. As Paul mentioned, I'm Marlon Eve. I'm Deputy Administrator in the Office of National Programs. As we begin our discussion of new data management and public access guidance at ARS, I want to take a couple of moments to give you some context. ARS is the premier agricultural research agency in the world. As such, researchers, collaborators, customers, and stakeholders from around the world look to us for reliable, transparent data. Over the past decade, efforts across the federal government have increasingly focused on making publicly funded research and data more accessible and more widely applicable. As a result, ARS, USDA, and other federal departments and agencies have been required to put policies and guidance in place that help ensure that our data are publicly available and accessible. P&P 630.0 is an ARS effort to develop that kind of guidance. Our goal in developing this guidance was to provide clarity to our researchers, helping ensure compliance with federal requirements and improved preservation and accessibility of the data assets that will always be at the heart of the ARS mission to deliver scientific solutions to national and global agricultural challenges. To create this guidance, ARS assembled a team of experts that included deputy administrators, national program leaders, research leaders, and experts from the National Agricultural Library and the Office of Scientific Quality Review. This team took over a year to carefully understand all of the federal requirements and data management challenges in the field in order to develop the guidance you will hear about today. In the process of developing this guidance, we have engaged many agency researchers, researchers and research leaders in an effort to make sure it is as meaningful and applicable as possible. I hope you find this resource helpful, and I trust that even as this guidance helps ensure that we are doing what is necessary to preserve our data, that you will also find that it helps you gain exposure and impact for your research. Now I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Tim Reinhardt, one of the national program leaders who helped us develop this guidance. Tim?
Thanks for the introduction, Marlon. I'm Tim Reinhardt. I'm the national program leader for specialty crops, and I was part of the team that helped put this together. Before joining the Office of National Programs, I was an ARS scientist for 14 years. I know from my experience that data management planning isn't something that we talk about very much. But I wanted to tell you a personal story today that highlights why I think that data management is so important to the long-term success of ARS. So Chad Finn was a friend and a fellow ARS scientist. He was probably one of the most prolific and enthusiastic plant breeders that I've ever known. Last year, Chad died while he was on vacation in Hawaii. He was only 57 years old when he passed away, which is young for an ARS scientist. And his unexpected death was a shock to his friends, his collaborators, and especially myself, who was his national program leader. Chad had numerous experiments underway, including the evaluation and release of varieties that he had been working on for years. Some of them he had been working on for decades. So in his 26 years as an ARS scientist, Chad had released over 51 new cultivars, including blackberry, raspberry, blueberry, and strawberry varieties. So he worked tirelessly to improve small fruit crops for farmers. And he was really known for having one of the most diverse berry breeding programs in the world. So losing Chad could have been the worst case scenario for ARS. And because of the timing of it, it was so tragic and unexpected, could have been a worst case scenario for his legacy because no one saw it coming. But after he was gone, we needed to access his data. We needed to understand the inventories of all of his plants. We needed to understand his observations, including all of the information around why he was collecting the data that he was collecting. And we needed this so we could preserve his experiments and ARS could continue his research. We needed this for the program, which is my responsibility as national program leader, but also for the stakeholders and customers that had such deep relationships with Chad Finn. So fortunately, Chad had an amazing data management strategy. And this was carefully outlined in his research planning and really consistently implemented in his research program over many years. And a year before he passed away, I visited Chad for a tour of his data management because I was looking for examples that we could incorporate into Breeding Insight. So Chad showed me everything, and he explained why he thought it was so important, mostly for his own efficiency in his breeding program, but also because he valued the ability to share data easily with others. And because he had put so much thought and effort into his data management planning and the implementation, most of our discussions when I visited him was about the agreements and who in industry and the other scientists that would have access to his program. So at the time, we were anticipating a funding increase to hire a new scientist. And Chad was very proud that he would be able to share years of his work with this new scientist, including what he called his historical data that wasn't published anywhere and was not really useful to his research anymore. It was mostly validation of industry standards, but these data would be incredibly valuable to a new scientist coming on board. So I want to share with you a couple other things that Chad and I talked about. He wanted his data management coordinated, not only with the Office of National Programs, but also the broader research community in which he was very much a leader. He wanted to see his data benefit this broad community and the stakeholders. Chad also showed me how he implemented his own fine scale planning. And for plant breeding, this included things like trait ontologies, data standards, the metadata that was automatically collected when he walked his fields, and other details. Chad also explained how he updated his data management plans because he was adding new technology to his breeding program. I don't think he ever published a manuscript about these data management efforts, but he was proud that it was growing along with his research program as his research grew. And finally, we talked about the long-term storage of his data and how he was personally funding the preservation of his data. Honestly, this is something when we talked about that, we talked about how ARS might be able to help him with those efforts because he felt like he was doing this out of his program on his own. So I know that Chad's circumstances are rare and tragic, but his data management wasn't about planning for an emergency. Chad's legacy was implementing a vision for small fruit breeding, and it was driven by his appreciation for collaboration and being the best possible scientist he could be. So to his credit, his research continues uninterrupted, and I'm confident that the full value of his expertise and his efforts will be realized for ARS and for the benefit of the small fruit stakeholders that he dearly loved. So this is why I think that data management planning is such an important part of our success at ARS, because we can't predict everything that's going to happen. And there are other reasons as well. And so I want to turn things over to Jeff Valet for his comments on this.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm Jeff Valet, and I am a national program leader for food animal production, and I also helped with the development of this P&P. And I've been asked to talk about a recent publication in which public access data was very, very important in the development of the publication. And what I want to talk about today is some work that was done by George Liu's lab at our Beltsville location here in Maryland. This paper was published, the authors are Fang et al. In 2020, and it was published in Genome Research. In this experiment, the scientists in the lab integrated 723 transcriptomes from 91 tissues and cell types with, along with epigenetic chromatin marks data and genome-wide association analysis data to construct a cattle tissue gene expression atlas. For this experiment, nearly 80% of the transcriptome data, 80% of the 723 transcriptomes was actually public data and was accessed from various databases. So they were able to construct this gene atlas, and the atlas will be useful in understanding the role of tissue gene expression and the control of gene expression using the epigenetic chromatin marks as they relate to changes in quantitative traits in beef cattle. So using this atlas can point to genetic variation that alters gene expression, resulting in an improved ability to do genomic selection in cattle. There's a potential here to support not only genomic selection, but also using this tissue atlas, we should be able to look at genetic variation and figure out how to use directed gene editing for improvement in traits. We're looking to use a similar strategy in other species, and in fact, we're trying to develop a similar effort in pigs right now. I want to reiterate, though, that none of this could have been done without the ability to access publicly available data to generate this very excellent piece of work. At this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Paul.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff and Tim. Just want to bring home a couple of additional points from this slide about some issues that we talk a lot about in ARS. First of all, the importance of being able to increase the impact of our research. So there's studies that have been done that illustrate how publicly accessible data increase the citation on average 25% for publications for materials that have data associated with them. So that's one reason that we want to focus on making sure that we make the data associated with our publications accessible. There are also other studies that talk about how rapidly data is lost out from the work of a publication. On average, 70% of the data is lost per year post-publication. So that also points to why it's important to have good data management strategies in place to protect that data and connect it back to the publications. And then third, from a scientific integrity perspective, it's very important that we're able to maintain data and connect them back to the publications so that we can ensure the reputation of our scientists, of our labs, of our agency, and of our department. So there's a lot of tight connection between data management and the integrity of the work that we do in the scientific realm. So we can go to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the origins of this requirement. On the left side, there are a series of different statutes and OMB guidances that kind of drive the direction for why we are required to do a lot of the work that we need to do around data management and public access. Some of these laws date back to the 19th century. Some of them are more current in the last several years, and you can take a look at those titles there and go back and take a look at them at your leisure. More recently, we have a number of different principal drivers that are focused on scientific integrity, as I just mentioned, some policies from the last administration around making data open and accessible and machine readable so that it can be used for reuse and scientific integrity, but also to do bigger, better science. And then also some policy work that we've been doing here or leading here at the library around making this data, the scientific data and the publications related to them publicly accessible. And you can kind of see those different drivers. And we've been a leader here at USDA in doing this kind of work going back to 2013 with the OSTP memo that kind of started all of this work. So the main thing we want to communicate with this is that we've talked a little bit about stories that make the point about why it's important to manage data for our scientific work. We also want to make the point that there are laws and regulations that require us to do what we're talking about today, and this isn't something that we've just kind of dreamt up and forced on folks. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I want to do a little bit of an overview of the overview, as we call it, and talk a little bit about what's in P&P 630 specifically. And if you go to that P&P, you'll see that it's 23 pages long, 17 pages of which is the policy and procedure itself, and then there's two appendices that kind of describe some specific process issues. And I would really encourage you to take a look at that at your leisure and read it closely. The other thing I'd also say is that we're going to cover some different parts of the P&P today as is described here on this slide, but I want to reinforce the third bullet, the training and support, that the National Ag Library and our folks over in the Oscar team will be working together on a number of other checklists and webinars and other products that will help move along the implementation of this policy as well. And we know that there's going to be some questions about what's in scope, public access waivers and procedures, and we'll try to get at some of that at a high level today. And again, we'll have some opportunities to do some more training and some more outreach on some specifics. And of course, we're here to work with you on any specific questions that you have related to the P&P going forward. So let's go to the next slide. Want to emphasize two things that are kind of obvious from the title of the P&P, both the requirements for data management and then the requirements for public access, and kind of talk about those as two distinct or kind of separate goals. So on the data management side, we want to focus on managing data as an asset of our agency and our department. It's an important piece of the scientific process that we need to maintain. We want to talk about how practice of sound governance makes us able to make data available into the future for bigger, better science or for scientific integrity purposes. We also want to talk about how we want to ensure effective access to, use of, and reliable preservation of data into the future. And data management plans allow us to do that kind of work. And again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but we really want to emphasize with the data management planning activity the need to protect the scientific integrity of our scientists, our agency, and the department. And we'll talk a little bit more about those things into the future. The second part of the policy has to do with public access. And we want to kind of lay out the marker that data are publicly accessible within 30 months from when the data collection is complete as defined by the data management plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. And through public access, data may be reused. And I've mentioned a little bit about data reuse for bigger, better science or advancing scientific research, but there's also other kinds of uses for these data that we want to make them available. There's some literature about ground truthing of instrumentation and things like that. So it's not just scientific research, but looking at methods and the efficacy of some of the data in other data sets that kind of help understand what's going on into the future with related research. So we can go to the next slide, please. So the Office of Scientific Quality Review Data Management Plan. I want to talk a little bit about the elements of a data management plan as they're required at the project level within the OSCAR process. Want to talk a little, so let's kind of go over what those plan elements are, and there are 6 of them. And I also want to point out that one of the appendices to the P&P includes the data management plan so you can get a sense of how this would actually work. So we want to have the expected data types, the data formats and the standards for those data, storage and preservation of access to those data over a period of time, how data sharing and public access are going to work. We want to identify who's responsible for what and for what period of time in managing the data, which is also part of the plan. And then how are we going to monitor and report on carrying out the different provisions of the data management plan. And one of the things that we have within the P&P itself is the notion that you're doing this data management not just because the regulations require it, but more back to what Tim was talking about, how effective data management helps with the scientific work that we're doing. And it's important to go back and take a look at how data management is being carried out on an annual basis with your plan. So at the project level, we're going to talk, the policy talks about access and sharing procedures during the project, as access procedures after the project. So that's what this plan lays out. When data collection is considered complete as defined by the data management plan, which is kind of helps set that 30-month time frame. And that's generally when the paper is accepted for publication. The policy also talks about where the data need to be stored and both at the National Ag Library and is kind of defined on how to get to that kind of resource. We can help you identify where the data should be stored and what the long-term preservation plan for access needs to be for those data, which is connected to that repository. The policy also calls for ensuring that there are unique identifiers or digital object identifiers for the data themselves, separate from the publication. And also talks about the data management plan also should lay out what the public access provisions and if there are any exclusions for them. And we will talk a little bit more about that as we go into the presentation. So we can go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, there are different components to the data management plan as part of the OSCR process. And one of the main things that you need to do within the data management plan is identify a suitable domain-specific repository. And there's some direction on how that can be done through Ag Data Commons. The USGS has a list of acceptable repositories in the natural resources area that we can point you to. And then re3data.org also identifies over 2,000 disciplinary specific repositories that would be appropriate for your data. And we also want to make sure that you get a digital object identifier for your data set. And this is one of the repository services that the repository you go to should be able to do. And also the Ag Data Commons here at the National Ag Library can issue you or a DOI for your data as long as we're able to have a copy of that data in the Ag Data Commons here at the library. And just as a point of emphasis, the Ag Data Commons is a generalist data repository, and but more importantly, we're a catalog to all the USDA funded data sets, and it's important to and required that you register those data in the DOI with us at the National Ag Library. Can we go to the next slide, please? As I mentioned before, with the OSCR process and the data management plan, there is an example of a data management plan on page 18 of P&P630. And to kind of go over what those, you can read that data management plan itself in the P&P, but it will go, you should be able to trace from the P&P to that example what would be required to meet the different 6 parts of a data management plan around the formats, the standards by which you're going to manage the data, defining when the data collection is complete, and then how the data will be shared between researchers or members within the team, both from a technical perspective as well as from a higher level kind of policy perspective. So the main thing I just want to do with this slide is make sure that you're connecting back to that example at the end of the P&P. So we can go to the next slide. As I introduced earlier in the presentation, this is just one of a number of different activities that we're doing here at the National Ag Library, as well as with our colleagues in the Office of Scientific Quality Review and our colleagues in the Office of National Programs around training and support for effective data management. So you can see the list of different training webinars that we're doing, including today's P&P630 overview. But we also have a number of different resources that we offer through the National Ag Library related to the Digitop service to have access to the scholarly literature and different types of tools to do analysis, bibliometric analysis of impact and those sorts of things. We also have resources here online for data management development. We have overviews of the Ag Data Commons tool itself and how to upload data and those sorts of things. And Susan McCarthy, the Associate Director for the Knowledge Services Division, spoke a little bit about some of these things as we were coming online this afternoon related to the data and the literature support that we provide. And then we're also going to be developing some ways to offer some more informal or ad hoc support with office hours and working with our metadata librarians here at NAL to provide support on developing your data management plans and uploading data into the Ag Data Commons, identifying appropriate repositories for your data in a kind of domain-specific kind of way. So this is all to say there is more to come from us. So one of the main topics within the P&P is what is in scope for public access. So we're kind of transitioning from that data management piece to the public access piece of the P&P. So data associated with peer-reviewed publications is the focus of the public access policy itself at a minimum. So you can read what is scientific research findings or data, and essentially what we're looking to do is, at a minimum, make accessible for public access data that are related to the specific peer-reviewed scholarly article that documents the scientific work that you or your research team has done. What is not within scope of the public access policy is administrative or program data about how research is conducted or other kinds of administrative activities within ARS. Personally identifiable information or other information that's covered by other statutes or regulations around not making those data accessible. And we have some of those identified here: proprietary data, potential dual use data, data related to patent or other business protections, data that are covered by the Freedom of Information Act, limited by other laws or regulations. And then other types of data that are not covered by the scope of this include models and other secondary data. Those are all listed within the P&P630 itself. We do want to make a kind of a key distinction. There are things that are not within scope that should not be shared because they're not public or they're not connected to a peer-reviewed research. But there are other things that might be good as supplementary products or artifacts that should be connected to the data, but are not required by the public access policy. And that's the kind of thing that we can work through with you here at the National Ag Library, either with our metadata librarians or other staff members within our Knowledge Services Division. So we can go to the next slide, please. So we kind of previewed the notion of public access waivers. So the point we want to make is that the expectation is data are to be made public within 30 months from when data gathering is complete as defined in the data management plan. So one of the key points is that you have some latitude in how you define that within the data management plan. If it's impractical or detrimental to the ARS mission, you can make a waiver request submitted through your chain of command through the research leader up to the area director. And then it goes through some other processes which we can, which are described in great detail with the artifacts on how to do it within P&P630. And also we want to make clear that you might not know that you need a waiver as you're doing the original data management plan in the OSCR process. And the waivers can be submitted at any time prior to the 30-month release requirement within the policy. So I want to talk a little bit about the public access waiver procedure. And again, I encourage you to take a look at the P&P itself to kind of walk through it in more specific detail. But essentially, it's pretty straightforward. The scientist prepares a decision memorandum. And like I said, there's a template for this in one of the appendices to P&P630. The research leader reviews the memorandum and moves the request to the area director. The area director reviews the request and sends it to the Office of National Programs. And then the Office of National Programs reviews the requests, and if they approve the request as it proceeds, the final decision is made by the Office of the Chief Scientist. Some of the reasons why you would perhaps pursue a public access waiver are identified in the policy itself, but also here on this slide. You might want to have a longer than 30-month public release period if there's imminent release of a follow-on study using the same data. There are issues related to the time to process a more comprehensive review for dual use considerations or other considerations that are part of that reason why you wouldn't or not required to make data publicly accessible. And then also, if there are specific issues related to the data and there's a need for additional resources to convert the data into a machine readable format, which is one of the guidances from OMB that directs how this works, that the data need to be machine readable. If there are needs to convert data or otherwise massage it to make it machine readable so that it can be publicly accessible, that can also be a reason for looking to the Office of the Chief Scientist through that process. I just kind of described it at a high level to get that 30-month exception. So it's kind of a procedures review and recap. It's always important, as it is separate from data management, to consult with the Office of Technology Transfer to coordinate public release of data products specifically, which is the topic of this P&P. Develop the project level plan for the OSCAR review. Plans at other scales may also be desirable, either for fine granularity down at the experiment level, if you want to be clear about the needs for particular data for a particular experiment that's part of a larger project, that's perhaps important to do. And then also for the larger scale multi-site or network kinds of research that ARS is engaged in. The LTAR network, for instance, is an example of that. And the need to make sure, either for the fine-grained data management plans or for the network data management plans or data management policies, making sure that they're all consistent with what's described within P&P630 is also very important. But if you're doing data management, it's more than likely, as you're doing data management, if there's different levels of aggregation, it's more than likely that you're following these procedures anyway. But it's good to keep those kinds of things in mind to make sure that this policy is nested. The other thing we also kind of want to review and recap is the notion of the periodic review of the data management plan. I kind of laid out why you have to do this from a statutory and regulatory perspective, but the story that Tim told, that's one of the real reasons, both from he offered it in a personal perspective, but also from a practical perspective. We want to be able to understand how these policies or how these plans are playing out, and then how they need to be updated if there's staffing changes or organizational changes or changes in the way the project's being carried out itself. So as I had mentioned before, the policy recommends looking at this on an annual basis. And then the other main item to focus on is making sure that your data are deposited in a reputable repository for public access. And again, the National Ag Library can aid you in identifying one, or being able to bring those data into the Ag Data Commons as we're cataloging those data within our platform. Just to give you a sense of the amount of data that we have in Ag Data Commons, 10% of the citations in our catalog we have the data for, so 90% of the data are residing in other repositories, domain-specific repositories. So our interest in Ag Data Commons and our interest for the department and for the agency is to catalog those data so that we know where the data are related to USDA-funded research, and then to also provide a repository for those data that cannot be deposited in other domain-specific repositories. And then the last couple of requirements I also want to mention, which are also part of the P&P 630, is the whole notion of making sure that you have digital object identifiers, DOIs for the data sets themselves. Again, the reputable repositories and the domains should issue you a DOI for your data. But if not, we can take a copy of that data into the National Ag Library through Ag Data Commons and issue you a DOI for the data. Then also, we want to make sure and reemphasize, it's separate from this presentation, but all of our ARA scientists who are publishing must have an ORCID ID so that we can do a lot of that analysis of the impact of our research and the publication of our data, and be able to understand, again, the impact of the research that we're doing, both the data and the publications themselves. We'll go to the next slide. So at this point, if you have any questions about the policy itself, we would encourage you to post some questions here in the chat, and we can answer them either by me or Dr. Cindy Parr, who is the Acting Assistant Chief Data Officer for the Research, Education, and Economics Mission Area, and a Senior Data Policy Analyst here at NAL. Susan McCarthy, who I mentioned before, Dr. McCarthy is the Associate Director for Knowledge Services here at the National Ag Library, and I can jump in and try to answer some questions as well. And my colleagues from the ARS Data Management Working Group are also online here. Marlon and Tim and Jeff Silverstein as well. If there are any questions that you have, we can either send them in to us and we can kind of follow up on them, or we can have some time for question and answer here as part of our presentation today. So with that, I would like to say thank you for coming out for our webinar today, and we'll take a look for some questions. All right, so we have a question in the chat. Please distinguish between data and results. I can't determine if you want publicly available data or results. Who would like to take a stab at that one? Tim or Marlon?
I'm not sure it's my place to make this distinction, but I was under the impression that we were talking about data. So the results are published. This needs to be the data that underpins those scientific findings in those publications.
Yeah, I agree with that, Tim. I think that's how we had interpreted it, was when a paper is published, it is the data that supports what's reported in that publication.
I'll just add that the intent here is to be able to reuse the data for other purposes. So it's the data. The results will be in the publication. The intent here is to be able to reuse the data for other, to generate other results.
All right, thank you. I guess we should see if that answered Mike's question. I think I think it did. Let's see here.
We do have another question that was sent to me. Where do we find the links for the Ag Data Commons overview and the data submission on Ag Data Commons trainings? And the Ag Data Commons overview, I'm not sure what you mean exactly. If that's, we do have a webinar that we gave an overview about the Ag Data Commons and how to submit, and that's on the National Agricultural Library's YouTube channel. And if you go to data.nal.usda.gov, that's the Ag Data Commons main page. And if you go to About, oh, where can we find the, oh, different questions. Okay. So yeah, if you go to About, and then there's a link to webinars, and you can find all of those trainings. So the webinar about the Ag Data Commons and trainings there. And then, oh, more people are sending directly to me. Where can we find the P&P? Is it on Axon? And we're looking and can't easily find it.
I can answer that question. The P&P is on Axon. You go to the place where they have the P&Ps listed. I think if you go to the main page, it's like the second tile from the left. And you just go down and you find P&Ps, and it's 630, and it's there. So that raises actually a point that you're not supposed to download and share the P&P outside of the agency. This is an official document, so they want to keep the official copy of it, you know, active and live on the Axon site. And we have recorded this session. We will be making this session available publicly once we get the 508 situation squared away with it. And it very likely will end up on Axon.
So we have another question in the chat. For publications, we have supplementary tables with actual data within the publication. Is that sufficient for the public access policy?
Yeah, I think I can take that one, Paul. My interpretation is that that would be minimally sufficient. What the policy is specifying is that the data that supports a publication is what needs to be preserved and accessible. As Dr. Valle said a moment ago, really the target is that additional research effort could be done with this data, new discoveries could be made. And so optimally, we would really like to see more than just that bare minimum that supports the tabular information in the publication. But that's a starting point.
And to amplify on that, within the P&P, there's, to Dr. Eve's point, there's a description of what's minimally required, and then some of the advantages of putting additional artifacts or making additional artifacts of the process publicly accessible. While it's not required, it does help with some of the reuse opportunities with the data and context adding kinds of things with the data as well. And then the other thing I would also go back to, while there are tables that are within the publications, there are requirements for making the data machine readable for the reuse, so that may play into determining whether you're meeting the letter of the policy versus the kind of the intent of what we're trying to do to make this data accessible and reusable for bigger, better science or for scientific integrity purposes.
I would just add to what Paul is saying, that the part of this process that Paul mentioned of assigning a DOI to your data set has incredible value for you as a researcher. So having your data preserved in this way with an associated DOI makes it much easier for other researchers to cite that they've used your data, for you to track how widely that data has been accessed or used. And so there's a number of benefits to having your data associated in this way. So it's not just purely about meeting the requirements of the federal government, but also what value can we add to help support you in your research.
Thank you. So we have another question about whether the P&P is retroactive, and if so, how far back do we need to go back in our published work to make data accessible? And the P&P lays out how this is a going forward requirement starting now with the publication of the P&P. Having said that, if there are needs or opportunities or desires to make data available to previously published materials, we want to work with you to make that content available. But the P&P describes how this is a going forward piece. And actually, this is why we're doing this overview now, as more national programs are moving through the OSCAR process, and there are requirements within the OSCAR process for data management plans and the policy for making the data publicly accessible. That's why we're doing this now as a going forward proposition. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Susan.
No, I completely agree. It is, we were trying to leverage existing procedures that are within the ARS research data lifecycle. So getting this policy implemented, we wanted to connect with the OSCAR process. So you are the first group that will, the MP103 is the first group that will be actually helping us to test what we're doing, to make sure that we can put together procedures and support to help the next round as we move through the year. And so, no, there's no requirement for going back retroactively, but you do benefit in many other ways, as we've already documented, you know, by doing what you can. And we are trying to help in that area. We have a small project going on at the library right now, which we're calling data rescue, if you will, where we're trying to look at some, you know, historically important data sets and see what we can do to help with recovering those, making sure that they get stored into a reputable repository and appropriately described.
Thank you, Susan.
I think that segues nicely into the next question that's here. I can read it. It's, so if I understand the Dr. Finn example, a great deal of the data he captured and which held value was not necessarily related to publications, but also for the succession of work within the lab from scientist to scientist. Is this not part of the desired outcome to this as well, as the discussion has seemed to now focus on data underlying a publication?
Yeah, I can take a first cut at this one. You know, it took our working group a long time to get P&P630 together. Part of the challenge was just really identifying what is the scope. And as I noted earlier, minimally, we had to make sure that we're complying with OMB and other federal statutes. But in order to really make this useful for national program planning, for research succession, for preserving legacy data, for the purposes of OSCAR in terms of evaluating projects, we needed to have this guidance also provide consistent information for data management planning specific to your research project. So we're trying to be a bit dual purpose here. We have the data management planning that really says how you determine you will handle your data on your project. And that's what's key to making sure other scientists can leverage and use that data. Key to making sure if something happens to you, like in the Dr. Finn story, that your data are not lost. And then also the role of the data management plan in making sure that we have the public access that meets the federal statutes and the legacy requirements. So again, it was part of the challenge of scoping our current project that you're picking up on quite well. So hopefully that answers your question. If there's additional questions around that, we can certainly discuss it more.
The next question is also a scope question. It's how does this apply to non-big data? For example, molecular biology-based assays with 10 replicates.
Yeah, my interpretation here would be that this really applies to all of our data, because our data are basically paid for by American taxpayer dollars. Big data, it becomes especially important because you have the need for interoperability and broader access, and so I would say it's especially important for big data, but the P&P applies to all of our data.
And the next question, if there is data used...
Yeah, I might chime in just a little bit.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Aaron, is that all right?
Yeah, that's
so
fine. Go ahead.
seems like there are definitely two things happening here, and one is data management planning, and the other one is the public access component to that. And I think from Chad's story, it was the data management planning. He planned for all of the data in his lab. It wasn't all recorded in one database, but he had a plan for all of his data. And that's a critical component that Marlon is talking about. The public access, is part of that plan, but doesn't apply to all of the data that needs to be considered. So I'm not clear from the big data question whether that's about the data management planning or about the public access component of it.
All right, next question is, if there is data used in publication but is commented as data not shown in the publication, are we requiring that any such data be in a publicly accessible database?
Paul, do you want to take that one, or should I take a first stab?
How about you take a first stab at it and I'll provide commentary.
Okay. Yeah, I think it would depend upon the nature of that data. If data not shown implies that there could be PII or some other sensitivity around that data, that would be the type of scenario where as Paul indicated in his presentation, we would seek a waiver and not make that publicly available. But if it's not a reason such as that, then I don't think there would be any issue with going ahead and making it publicly available. So I think it would be the nature of the information that would be most important in that discussion.
Yeah, and I would emphasize the need to kind of look at your circumstance against the P&P, and then have conversations within your lab, and we can consult with you or your national program leader if it's a really specific issue. But as we've talked about, there are exceptions for making material publicly accessible. And those are laid out within the P&P. But if there are reasons for exceptions, we can figure out how to proceed with them. But the intent is to manage the data effectively for the best science that we can do. And then also the public access part, as we've all talked about, making it accessible so that the taxpayers can see how their money is being spent to carry out scientific research and those sorts of things. And so we want to balance those kinds of things as we kind of think through these issues.
If I could just add another point of context. The there was a Harvard Data Review article recently, earlier this year, that pointed out that a lot of aspects of data reuse don't end up being published, but they become calibrations, for instruments. They become, ground truthing for people to establish, parameters for their experiments. So there are lots of reasons, for making your data accessible.
Thank you.
If I could just add one more thing to that, to the response to that. So oftentimes we don't show data if it's just supportive of the conditions under which the experiment is done. But I do think that even though there may not be room in the publication to show the data, you're making conclusions in that publication based on that data. So the data needs to be publicly accessible to support the conclusions that you've made.
And I believe that also ties back to one of the other points in the presentation about how publications are 25% more often cited if the data related to that publication are publicly accessible.
All right, we have one more question right now, and this actually looks like it's going to be one for me. If there are any more questions, we only have a few minutes left. Feel free to keep writing them in and we will get to them later. We can get back to you and publish them somewhere where everyone can get to them. This question is, could the Ag Data Commons be used to display cell lines, antibodies, germline strains for facilitating tech transfer to potential commercial companies? The Ag Data Commons can support files that people can download available publicly. We can't display information within the infrastructure of our system right now, though. It's just files and people can download them. We do recommend subject-specific repositories where possible, because those are going to be more geared toward the type of data that you have. And so those conditions may be a little more conducive to transferring the type of data you have. But if you don't have a subject-specific repository, the Ag Data Commons can definitely accommodate those files for you, and they will be publicly available for people to download and do with what they need to do.
All right, so with that, I believe Aaron has answered the last formal question we have in the chat. And as Aaron said, please feel free to continue to add questions here at the chat, or send them in to us here at the National Ag Library, and we will answer them for you. I want to, in conclusion, thank all the different folks who presented today and the folks who attended and asked questions as part of this webinar. I want to give a big shout out to Dr. Susan McCarthy, the Associate Director for Knowledge Services here at the National Agricultural Library, who is also one of the big conveners, coordinators, and helpers of making sure we got all of this work done for the P&P over the last year, as Dr. Eve talked about. And again, all the members of the ARS Data Management Working Group who worked so hard to get us to this point. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And then also be on the lookout for more training and guidance products and things like that to help make data management happen more effectively within ARS, and also make sure that we meet the different public access requirements that we have within the department and across the federal government. So with that, thanks so much for participating, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
USDA is an equal opportunity provider and employer.